So good evening, everybody from Radical Anthropology in London, and welcome to everybody in far-flung corners of the planet. It's lovely to see you, and I hope there's plenty of people who were here last week as well. But if you have come for the first time, you're welcome, doubly welcome. And we're going to continue from last week, where Chris was talking about some of the kind of early stages of human evolution, including grandmothering and cooperative childcare, contrasts between primate social life and human social life. But today, Chris is going to try and finish off the story of the human revolution and the emergence of our species, Homo sapiens, in Africa. So I don't think I need to say much more. Chris Knight, founder of Radical Anthropology Group, author of Blood Relations. I think, Chris, you can take it away.
Okay, I was going to start by recording that there are, in a way, two ways of doing science, each necessary to the other, each equally valid. And many years ago, I read a marvelous book by T.S. Kuhn, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And he pointed out that now and again, you get a completely kind of illegal insurrection against all current knowledge. Illegal in the sense that the new theory, I mean, an obvious example is Galileo discovering that the Earth is round and it moved. Obviously, Copernicus got there a bit earlier, but somehow it was kind of illegal because everybody thought at the time that, well, you know, the Earth is the one thing we know is still. Movement takes place in relationship to the Earth, and it can't be round, otherwise we'll fall off. And the whole theory seemed absolutely absurd. So T.S. Kuhn was saying that, first of all, you have a completely absurd theory, just defies all common sense. And then once that paradigm has kind of succeeded, usually because all the old philosophers and scientists die, then you have what's called mopping up operations. So I thought I'd just remind everyone of that fact. There's a marvelous quote from Einstein. If at first the idea is not absurd, then there's no hope for it. Now, of course, it doesn't mean that just because your idea is completely absurd, it must be true. What it means is that theories which emerge out of the prevailing common sense aren't really going to make a huge difference. And so today with human origins research, there's the continuing process of filling in gaps, changing dates, finding new fossils, discovering more things about different kinds of primates and so on, a continuous process. And then there's another possibility, which is that we've kind of got everything wrong, and we need a completely new start. And anyone who tries to do that will be dismissed, obviously, as kind of absurd, because this isn't common sense. And I'm aware that to talk about menstruation, the moon, menstrual synchrony, menstrual taboos, all these things which I've been writing about, I'm more and more aware that actually, when these ideas get dismissed, it's sort of because they're not common sense. They seem to be absurd. And I'm really emphasizing that that isn't anything in favor of my particular theory. But the point about an absurd theory is that if it's sufficiently precise in its absurdity, it should be very easy to make predictions from the theory, just drawing out the internal logic of that theory and then test them against the evidence. So that's a kind of introduction. And in the course of the discussions we've been having on this amazing book by David Graeber and David Wengrow, The Dawn of Everything, I remember one of the friends and supporters of the two Davids was saying, "Oh, Chris Knight wrote a book which is entirely dependent on the idea of menstrual synchrony, and we all know that that's wrong. So what's left of that book?" And that was kind of in reply to one of my reviews of the Dawn of Everything. So more to the point, but still on the question of absurdity, a very kind of odd book written in the 1920s by an anthropologist called A.M. Hokar, features quite frequently in David Graeber's writings, particularly his book with Marshall Sahlins on kings. And it's also referred to quite frequently in The Dawn of Everything. Now, A.M. Hogarth in the 20s put forward a theory. And the theory is that history begins with religion. And religion begins with divine kingship. And that the earliest kings were sun kings. And that work has its parallels really in The Dawn of Everything, because The Dawn of Everything does start with what the authors call complexity, with certain kind of elites which seem to be arising, shamanistic elites, priesthoods, and so on in parts of the Upper Paleolithic. And what I want to do is to point out the puzzles of the idea that the earliest religion was that of divine kings, that these divine kings were sun kings, that in other words, that the earliest religion was a form of sun worship. And I'm going to read out a few things from another book, which again, Graeber cites, and it's The Golden Bough by James Fraser. And he talks about the two rules or taboos by which the life of divine kings or priests is regulated. One, not to touch the ground. And I've got here all these different examples. Obviously, I won't take too much time, but I'll just read a few of them because they're interesting. The supreme pontiff of the Zapotecs in Mexico profaned his sanctity if he so much as touched the ground with his foot. Montezuma, Emperor of Mexico, never set foot on the ground. He was always carried on the shoulders of noblemen, and if he lighted anywhere, they laid rich tapestry to walk upon. The Mikado of Japan to touch the ground with his foot was a shameful degradation, enough to deprive him of his office. Outside his palace, he was carried on men's shoulders. The king and queen of Tahiti might not touch the ground anywhere but within their hereditary domains. In traveling from place to place, they were carried on the shoulders of sacred men. And it goes on and on and on all around the world. So all these divine kings had this restriction placed upon them, which is that they're not allowed to touch the ground. Their feet mustn't touch the ground. And then Fraser points out that there's a second rule, which seems to apply to all these very powerful figures, these divine kings, not to see the sun. So the second rule, I'm quoting from Fraser, is that the sun may not shine upon the divine person. This rule was observed both by the Mikado and by the pontiff of the Zapotecs, who was looked upon as a god whom the earth was not worthy to hold, nor the sun to shine upon. The Japanese would not allow that the Mikado should expose his sacred person to the open air, and the sun was not thought worthy to shine on his head. And I could go on and on and on. So if you're a divine king, there's those two absolutely critical rules which constrict your behavior. Don't touch the ground with your feet. Don't let the sun shine on your head. Now, we come to point 3 from Sir James Fraser. Now, interestingly, David Graeber cites the first part, which I've just read out about these divine kings, but he doesn't cite the second part, which is the seclusion of girls at puberty. Again, I'm quoting from Sir James Fraser, The Golden Bough. Now, it is remarkable that the foregoing two rules, not to touch the ground and not to see the sun, are observed either separately or conjointly by girls at puberty in many parts of the world. I just to give you the flavor. Among the Luango in Africa, girls at puberty are confined in separate huts, and they may not touch the ground with any part of their bare body. Among the Zulus of South Africa, when the first signs of puberty show themselves, while a girl is walking, gathering wood, or working in the field, she runs to the river and hides herself among the reeds for the day, so as not to be seen. She covers her head carefully with a blanket, that the sun may not shine on her head. With the Awakonde, a tribe at the northern end of Lake Nyasa, it is a rule that after her first menstruation, a girl must be kept apart in a darkened house and must never see the sun. In New Ireland, girls are confined for 4 or 5 years in small huts, been kept in the dark and not allowed to set foot on the ground. And it goes on and on and on. So I won't give you all the examples, although they're extraordinary. And then what Fraser does, he then talks about how in Europe, we had very similar superstitions based on fear of the supernatural potency of women when they menstruate, and particularly when they first menstruate. So he's just writing now. Among the civilized nations of Europe, the superstitions which cluster around this mysterious aspect of women's nature are not less extravagant. In the oldest existing encyclopedia, The Natural History of Pliny, the list of dangers apprehended from menstruation is longer than any furnished by mere barbarians. According to Pliny, the touch of a menstruous woman turned wine to vinegar, blighted crops, killed seedlings, blasted gardens, brought down the fruit from trees, dimmed mirrors, blunted razors, rusted iron and brass, especially at the waning of the moon, killed bees, or at least drove them from their hives, caused mares to miscarry, and so forth. And similarly, in various parts of Europe, it is still believed that if a woman in her courses enters a brewery, the beer will turn sour. If she touches beer, wine, vinegar, or milk, it will go bad. If she makes jam, it will not keep. If she mounts a mare, it will miscarry. If she touches buds, they will wither. If she climbs a cherry tree, it will die. And then, blah, blah, blah. And then he says, this is still from Fraser, thus the object of secluding women at menstruation is to neutralize the dangerous influences which are supposed to emanate from them at such times. And then he says, these are the same explanation, namely fear of this supernatural potency, applies to the observance of the same rules by divine kings and priests. They are only different manifestations of the same mysterious energy. And what's odd is that sun kings must keep in the dark. And that does seem to be absurd. If you're a sun king, why do you have to keep out of the sun? Why is the sun going to destroy your power? Or why? And by the way, Levi-Strauss points this out in his book, one of the volumes of extraordinary potent reason to let shine on their head is because the girl is more powerful than the sun. She could blot it out. She could cause an eclipse of the sun, or blot it out, or cause terrible thunderstorms. So it's the potency, the supernatural potency of the girl, which is the problem, because it might blot out the sun. But as Fraser points out, the supernatural potency of divine kings is just kind of identical. That the particular kind of potency is the same in either case, which of course indicates, I would have thought, that although these illustrations which Fraser cites at great length, dozens and dozens and dozens of them, of girls at the time of their first menstruation, secluded, hedged with taboos, the reason is because they're so powerful. And don't forget that divine kings are equally hedged with taboos, and the taboos are identical. So it seems to me that the idea of the sun kings, and that history starts with these, it's kind of looking at the backside of history. We need to kind of turn things around because something else must have been going on before. One of the things I thought we would do starting this talk is to look at kind of the reverse side of all this stuff. And to do that, I thought we'd start with a poem.
I wrote this poem with a very specific intent. I have a 13-year-old daughter. It is important to me that I throw every part of my experience and whatever wisdom I've gleaned from that, every part of my backbone toward her, to sustain her, to offer her language that lifts her up and keeps her up. That said, there is, for me, a necessary conversation that seeks to undermine the shaming that happens to some girls around menstruation. I had that experience of starting my period in 7th grade, boys, finding out that I had started my period, and then, it was some shit. Like, I'd be in the class with the frantic, like, gotta go to the bathroom now, wave, and then, like, oh, you're in a period, aren't you? That dumb shit. And so I said to my daughter, like, she starts her period and she's stricken and walks out the bathroom looking like she's died or something. And I wanted to undermine that. So I threw her a period party. My homies rolled up, dressed in red, and there was red food, red drinks. It was great. It was great. So, all read everything. Like it. So that's what it was. And it was wonderful. And then when I was in Austin, Texas for Women of the World this year, she sent me a screenshot of a tweet. And in 140 characters, this dummy, damn near undermined my legacy. This is my response to aforementioned dummy. Well, dude on Twitter says, quote, I was having sex with my girlfriend when she started her period. I dumped that bitch immediately, end quote. Dear nameless dummy on Twitter, you're the reason my daughter cried funeral tears when she started her period. The sudden grief all young girls feel after the matriculation from childhood and the induction into a reality that they gonna have to negotiate you and your disdain for what a woman's body can do. Herein begins an anatomy lesson infused with feminist politics because I hate you. There is a thing called a uterus. It sheds itself every 28 days or so, or in my case, every 23 days. I've always been a rule breaker. That's the anatomy part. I digress. The feminist politic part is that women know how to let things go, how to let a dying thing leave the body, how to become new, how to regenerate, how to wax and wane, not unlike the moon and tides, both of which influence how you behave. I digress. Women have vaginas that can speak to each other. By this I mean, when we're with our friends, our sisters, our mothers, our menstrual cycles will actually sync the fuck up. My own cervix is mad influential. Everybody I love knows how to bleed with me. Hold on to that. There's a metaphor in it. Hold on to that. But when your mother carried you, the ocean in her belly is what made you buoyant, made you possible. You had it under your tongue when you burst through her skin, wet and panting from the heat of her body, the body whose machinery you now mock on social media. That body wrapped you in everything that was miraculous about it and sung you lullabies laced in platelets, without which you wouldn't have no Twitter account at all, motherfucker. I digress. See, it's possible that we know the world better because of the blood that visits some of us. It interrupts our favorite white skirts and shows up at dinner parties unannounced. Blood will do that, period. It will come when you are not prepared for it. Blood does that, period. Blood is the biggest siren, and we understand that blood misbehaves. It does not wait for a hand signal or a welcome sign above the door. And when you deal in blood over and over again like we do, when it keeps returning to you, well, that makes you a warrior. And while all good generals know not to discuss battle plans with the enemy, let me say this to you, dummy on Twitter. If there's any balance in the universe at all, you're gonna be blessed with daughters. Blessed. Etymologically, blessed means to make bleed. See, now it's a lesson in linguistics. In other words, blood speaks. That's the message. Stay with me. See, your daughter's gonna teach you what all men must one day come to know, that women made of moonlight, magic, and macabre will make you know the blood. We gonna get it all over the sheets and car seats. We gonna do that. We gonna introduce you to our insides, period. And if you are as unprepared as we sometimes are, it'll get all over you and leave a forever stain. So to my daughter, should any fool mishandle the wild geography of your body, how it rides a red running current, like any good wolf or witch, well then just bleed, boo. Give that blood a biblical name. Something of stone and mortar. Name it after Eve's first rebellion in that garden. Name it after the last little girl to have her genitals mutilated in Kinshasa. That was this morning. Give it as many syllables as there are unreported rape cases. Name the blood something holy, something mighty, something unlanguageable, something in hieroglyphs, something that sounds like the end of the world. Name it for the roar between your legs and for the women who will not be named aimless here, just bleed anyhow. Spill your impossible scripture all over the good furniture. Bleed and bleed and bleed on everything he loves. Period.
A hard act to follow. Perhaps try to imagine, as she has done so powerfully, a world made for people who have cycles, people who have periods. So try to imagine a world made for people who have periods. And of course, the world that we know is one where, regardless of your state of your cycle, you've got to get up and go to work or look after your husband or cook the meals or take the kids to school, or whatever it is. Anyway, this world doesn't have the periodicity that women have. And of course, because when you're coming up to the period, you should be, and this is kind of going back to the kind of absurdity of James Fraser, you should be a divine king. You should be divine royalty. You should have people waiting on you. You should run around looking after other people's problems. And of course, when you should be, if you like, royalty, you're not allowed to be royalty, then you have problems. And of course, we have these kind of Western constructs which are all too real, such as premenstrual tension and all the various other things which go on, because you're not living in a world made for women. You're living in a world made for people who have penises and testicles, but certainly don't have periods. In other words, a non-periodic world. So I just thought, because of the rather negative examples of menstrual seclusion discussed by Sir James Fraser in The Golden Bough, I just thought I'd just remind everyone again of this extraordinary, beautiful book. I mean, this is Colin Turnbull's The Forest People. If anyone's just starting on hunter-gatherer ethnography, this is the book to start with. And I'm not going to spend too long on it, but he's now talking. These are the Bambuti people in the Ituri forest, he's just describing the difference between how menstruation is treated among the village people, the Bantu people, and how the hunter-gatherers he's working with, the gender egalitarian hunter-gatherers he's working with, conceive of it. So he's now saying. Let's find it now. Okay, the whole affair among the villages is a rather shameful one. The affair being first menstruation in the eyes of the villagers, as well as a dangerous one. It is something best concealed and not talked about in public. The girl is an object of suspicion, scorn, repulsion, and anger. It is not a happy coming of age. For the pygmies, the people of the forest, it is a very different thing. To them, blood is, in the usual context in which they see it, equally dreadful, but they recognize it not only as being the symbol of death, but also of life. And menstrual blood to them means life. Even between a husband and wife, it is not a frightening thing, although there are restrictions connected with it. In fact, they consider that any couple that really wants to have children should sleep with the moon. And so when a young pygmy girl begins to flower into maturity and blood comes to her for the first time, it comes to her as a gift, received with gratitude and rejoicing that the girl is now a potential mother, that she can now proudly and rightfully take a husband. There is not a word of fear or superstition, and everyone is told the good news. The girl enters seclusion, but not the seclusion of the village girl. She takes with her all her young friends, those who have not yet reached maturity, and some older ones. And this is the nearest the Bambuti have to a church. It's this large hut, telling us really that churches begin as menstrual huts. Again, sounds absurd, but there's not really too much doubt about it. They don't have any other church. So in the house of the Yalima, it's a especially large grass hut. In the house of the Yalima, the girls celebrate the happy event together. Together they are taught the arts and crafts of motherhood, and I won't go into all the singing. What happens is that the boys begin to hear this exciting news that the two girls, because two had their first period at the same time, two girls are coming into circulation. And what happens, the girls are inside the hut having a good time, laughing, chatting, and the girls are discussing which boy they fancy. And they've got these whips, these saplings. And every now and again, the girls will burst out and chase the boys. And any boy that's touched with a whip, he's on a bound to enter this hut. And he probably has his first sexual experience being jumped upon by a whole bunch of girls and slightly older women. a rather different initiation into sex than the kind of conquistador or macho versions of sexual initiation of so many patriarchal societies. And I won't go into it all now, but I mean, that's just a kind of antidote. And you'll find that African hunter-gatherers, when they're immediate returners, nearly all of them actually are, they're gender egalitarian, and the gender egalitarian works through menstruation in the sense that when a girl first menstruates, that's the most powerful ritual that the society will have. And the girl is, her blood is supernaturally potent, and in all cultures, of course, it's linked to the moon. And you can read Jerome Lewis's material as well, maybe more up-to-date material on all of that. Now, slightly changing the subject, I'm going to be moving now to, if you like, the science of all this. How did this come about? Okay, now I could ask Camilla to talk about this. It's about brain size, and I'll just say a couple of things that I'll hand over to Camilla. We humans have got extraordinarily large brains, and along the bottom there you've got millions of years. So go back 3 million years ago, and you've got the Australopithecines, and then coming towards naught to where we are now, 2 million years and 1 million years ago. You go from Australopithecus to Erectus to archaic humans, Neanderthals, and then ourselves. And can you see the almost vertical exponential increase in brain size on the far left there? That's in the last less than 500 million years, actually. And so we have chimp-sized brains, about literally over 300 cc's, twice chimp-sized brains. There's then a kind of blockage there, and then suddenly the brain size increases dramatically. Well, it's all about the quality of childcare. Camilla, do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, the whole point, which carries kind of from what we were talking about last week, is that brains are extraordinarily expensive tissue for maintaining metabolically. They require a large amount of energy, even as you're just sitting resting, compared to the average tissues of the rest of your body. And when it comes to very large brained babies, it is mothers who have to produce all the that child, and the child's brain is growing. And especially even after weaning the child's brain is growing very fast at that time, like 3-year-old, 4-year-old. And that child needs a special help with extra food. So we were talking last week about the grandmother as the likely extra help. Basically, the Australopithecine ancestors had the same size as chimpanzees, or a bit bigger than chimpanzee brain size. And this is what's known, that where those black dots, that's what's known as, it's called a gray ceiling. It's like a ceiling of brain size, which a mother, if it's a chimpanzee mother, a bonobo mother, a gorilla mother, or an Australopithecine mother, she can raise an offspring of that brain size, but she can't raise an offspring of larger because she's doing it all alone. Nobody's helping her. So this is like single mum hypothesis. Yeah, single mum manages all alone. So somehow 2 million years ago, we, or our ancestors, which would have been the early Erectus ancestors, they smashed through the ceiling. From what we were saying last week, the only way that became possible was by some form of cooperative childcare, what Sarah Hurdy calls cooperative childcare. So mothers started to get help from others. And a mother's mother would be, the grandmother hypothesis, a mother's mother would be the obvious place where that help came. So we have Homo erectus sort of drifting over. Homo erectus lasts a long time down all the way in Asia, but that brain size kind of stays about 1100 cc until, as Chris says, in this last space, the last sort of 700,000 or 800,000 years, 500,000 or 600,000 years, we're suddenly going upwards again very rapidly. And we kind of have to explain what happened, because it's like a lid has come off the energy that's available to mothers to be able to raise offspring. And this goes for to be able to raise offspring with such large adult brain sizes. So these are actual brain sizes of fossil specimens. They're cranial capacities of fossil specimens, and they're adult cranial capacities. But for humans, most of adult brain size is already there by a 6 or 7 year old child. So mothers are having to do a large amount of that work, but they don't do it all by themselves. They must be getting help from somewhere. And the question is how, and the question is what happened. This is really the period leading up to the human revolution, that part of it, that last quarter, that last 400,000-500,000 years. Is that enough?
That's great. So what we think is that the earlier doubling of chimp brain size was, as Camilla was saying, with erectus, was basically women getting their mum and sisters to help with childcare. And the last,
we shouldn't say that men were not helping at all, no. But they're helping in relation to female core coalitions, most likely.
So, but that last extraordinary leap was as a result of the fact that something quite amazing happened, which was that the leisured sex, the male sex, the sex which in terms of reproduction doesn't have to do a lot of work, was suddenly mobilized. So males were now heavily provisioning, presumably largely by hunting, and that suddenly enabled this quite extraordinary, almost exponential vertical increase in brain size. So now, if we're interested in the dawn of everything, really going back, as we were saying last week, we need to be not just interested in sort of the formation of elites and what so-called social complexity and so on in the Upper Paleolithic 30,000 years ago. We need to go to the dawn of everything. And as we were saying last week, that means looking at ourselves, our bodies, our cooperative eyes, our strange ways of expressing our emotions, for example, laughter, but very, very significantly, very importantly, male and female reproductive anatomy and physiology. And there's no question about it. The changes in females played an absolute critical role. So concealed ovulation with continuous sexual receptivity. Now, I'm sure everyone knows this. Been to the zoo or seen pictures of chimps. The females have huge swellings of their genitals when they're around the period of estrus, which means that ovulation is kind of concealed because you can't tell exactly when the ovulation is occurring, but really the dominant males get it pretty accurately. Whereas human females have very effectively concealed the moment of ovulation and have evolved to be continuously sexually receptive. And what that does, it takes away from the male of the species what in other primates would be vital time-saving information. So just to explain what I mean by time-saving, from the Darwinian point of view, the male is built to get his genes into the future. And the more time he saves on getting a female pregnant, the quicker he can move on to the next female, the more his fitness, the more offspring he's likely to have. And so what he needs is information from the female to tell him what's the right time. And so it makes a lot of sense. In many parts of the animal world, the idea is to save time on sex. Well, concealing ovulation does the opposite. It makes it very difficult to save time on sex, because any male whose body, if you like, is designed to get females pregnant, he needs to spend some time, because if he doesn't spend any time, he's very unlikely to get anyone pregnant. So it scrambles information to males about the precise moment of fertility. And what that does, it leaves salient a signal which monkeys and apes and other great apes aren't too interested in. Menstruation occurs with our great ape relatives, but no one bothers about it too much, because the males have got this other hugely exciting signal of estrus. But if you take away the estrus, there's very little in the human female body that can tell a male when she might be or not, or isn't, when she is or isn't fertile. So menstruation, of course, is left as the only reliable cue that although a female is not pregnant right now, if you bond with her and have sex with her, you're likely to get her pregnant in the near future. And it is true that hunter-gatherers, as I was just reading out from Colin Turnbull, they assume that if you want to get somebody pregnant, have sex during menstruation. I should add that actually that's always imagined to be slightly naughty, because really the moon is woman's other husband, and the moon should be having sex with a woman during menstruation. So if a man has sex during menstruation, he's kind of getting one over on the moon, which is something which Jerome describes from his own field work among different hunter-gatherer population in southwestern part of the Congo rainforest. So menstruation is the only thing left that could tell a male kind of when a woman is likely to be available to conceive. So this is just the diagrams. I don't know, Camilla, do you want to talk about this, or shall I go through it quickly? Sometimes you do a better job than I do. How do you feel?
Just go for it.
All right. Okay. So all right. So now what we're having now.
If anything wrong, I'll interrupt.
Yes. If I get it wrong, interrupt, please. Thank you. So on the left, of course, you've got circles, meaning females. On the right, you've got triangles, meaning males. Very simple. And now there's only one female is now showing menstruation. And I just imagine a rather negative picture of cavemen chasing after females and dragging them back by the hair to their caves. We get the female to pick on is clearly the one who's not pregnant already and not breastfeeding already, but on the other hand, young enough to be impregnated. And so and don't forget, with this diagram, we're not talking about humans. We're not talking about nice human males with a moral consciousness, religion, morality, and stuff. We're really talking about kind of great apes, but they're great apes that have probably look pretty much like modern humans, but so far we haven't had the revolution, and so they're not really behaving like humans, they're behaving more like apes. So all the males are interested in that one female, and if they can bond with her, and maybe one of the males maybe have a battle with the others and drag off a female and go on safari with her, that dominant male ought to be able to get her pregnant, which would of course mean, and this is a critical point of this diagram, if males are useful things to have, and everyone should have at least one of them. In other words, if males are walking on two legs, they've got hands to carry stuff, they can bring back meat, help females who are breastfeeding or pregnant, what would happen is that menstruating female is depriving her sisters, or the others in her camp, of male commitment and attention. All the males are now interested in just one thing, getting that one female who can be got pregnant, getting her pregnant. So so her attractiveness, if you like, is at the expense of the other females. Now, in the animal world, especially among primates, which are very political animals with coalitions and counter coalitions and so on, dominance is always accompanied by resistance. So you expect if the males have got a strategy, the females will have a counter strategy. Those other females don't want to be deprived of males if males can be useful because they can bring provisions. And so the females are expected to do something about that. And what they do is they act first. They're closer to that girl who's begun to menstruate. They begin to surround her, and they confuse the signals. And in other words, that's preventing the males from knowing which one of those females is or isn't menstruating. And they do it confusing the signals by painting up, theoretically, possibly with the girl's own blood a bit, but probably with other kinds of blood or other kinds of red cosmetics, is the way we put it in rag. And that happened, and sorry, I just need to go back, sorry. And kind of the overall argument in this whole talk this evening is we're engaging in a discussion and an argument with Graeber and Rengger, whose argument is that the dawn of everything occurred 30,000 years ago, 40,000 years ago in the European Upper Paleolithic. And we're saying, well, no, you have to go much, much further back. And we're not just talking about simple hunter-gatherers doing simple things. We're talking about complex society, complex art, ritual, language, and symbolic culture. And we owe these things not to European male elites inventing novelties during the so-called Upper Paleolithic Revolution, but to our African ancestors who much earlier established an egalitarian way of life during the course of a human revolution, led by women in coalitionary resistance against male sexual harassment and dominance. And many of these revolutionary traditions live on to this day. So, okay, so how I had a picture up there of women confusing men by painting up so that the men, I shouldn't say men really, I should say evolving human males can't tell which female to target. And the way they do it, of course, is this way, painting up with red ochre. This is an example of perhaps the best known cosmetic users of red ochre, the Himba in Namibia. So on the left there, Namibia, a Himba girl grinding the red ochre. On the top right there, women. What you can see what in this rather beautiful picture, the women are, it's not competitive. The women are benefiting from each other's attractiveness by covering them in with this ochre. And then in the bottom right here, we have a ritual just before a girl gets married, where the women are kind of laying claim to her first to make sure that everyone knows that that girl belongs to them, and they're doing a dance. And it's very similar actually to the Eland bull dance, even though these people these days are pastoralists rather than hunters and gatherers. So they're acting out, they're doing a dance, which is, in our terminology we describe as wrong species. They're pretending to be a different species than human species in order to act defiantly towards men. So this is the Female Cosmetic Coalition or sex strike hypothesis. And as I said earlier, when you have a kind of absurd theory, a theory which defies common sense, it's not much use unless it makes predictions. And again, the predictions might seem unexpected or even absurd. But a really powerful new theory is one where the predictions are apparently unlikely, apparently improbable. You wouldn't have thought of them without the theory, and yet when you test those predictions, it comes out on top. It all seems to work. So, if this theory, which I've outlined very briefly, about the emergence of symbolic behavior and the emergence of moral behavior, it's correct that we should find in the archaeological record the earliest evidence for symbolic behavior in the cosmetics industry focus on blood red pigments. So if you had different colored pigments, if you had black pigments, white pigments, yellowish pigments, it wouldn't be so good. There should be a window of emergence of symbolic culture, and it should, remember that slide when I showed that vertical increase in brain size? Well, that sudden increase in brain size, because we think it was the result of male sudden sort of spike in terms of male provisioning, then the window of emergence of this archaeological evidence for ochre use should correlate with that last phase of increase in what's called encephalization. That means increased brain size. And then finally, that last picture I showed you was these Himba women. They're doing a symbolic performance, and it's symbolic and metaphorical because it's imaginative, because they're not, when they're dressing up with the ochre, they're not presenting themselves as humans. They're presenting themselves as a different species. And in fact, not only a different species, but a different sex. So the way to reverse the ordinary signals of sexual availability is to signal wrong sex, wrong time, wrong species. And so we would expect, if the argument's right, that rock art, cave paintings, and other evidence of early forms of divinity, of spiritual potency, should take those paradoxical forms. And the cosmology, in other words, the myths and the rituals, should be lunar and menstrual. So this is the archaeology. This is red ochre. And it is just a simple fact that the first evidence in the archaeological record that the transition to symbolic culture has occurred, the earliest evidence is simply the archaeological findings of brilliant blood red ochre. That comes before anything else. And we assume that once the ochre is there, if the female resistance is there, females have established this fundamental principle of all the world's religions. It's a very good principle, namely that some things are sacred. And if the body isn't sacred, well, of course, nothing is sacred. So some things are sacred, namely the body, and you put ochre on your body to establish that critical point. The model we're putting forward is a Darwinian one, because it's based on the idea that, yes, we accept all the stuff that Darwinians talk about in terms of Darwinian fitness, but we're saying that when you look at fitness from both sides, not just male fitness, but female fitness, females should be expected to form coalitions and resist male harassment, resist attempts by males to seize hold of females that they can get pregnant. There should be a coalition resistance in it, and we would expect it to take the form of using red cosmetics to confuse males about who's menstruating and who isn't. And there's a picture of something which became very famous, hit all the headlines not so long ago. I'm going to just ask, okay, these are what completely changed the picture and destroyed the old idea, which to some extent it seems David Wengrow and David Graeber are still committed to, the old idea that somehow human symbolic culture was invented 30,000 years ago, perhaps 40,000 years ago, in Ice Age Europe during the Upper Paleolithic. What we now know is that symbolic culture was invented in Africa many tens of millennia earlier, and this is the evidence. These are clearly items of red ochre which show markings unmistakably indicating that some kind of art was going on. And look at the shapes, the pointed shapes of those pieces of ochre. They're clearly, with those beveled edges, are clearly designed to make patches of color with a sharp outline of color on some surface. I'm going to just hand over briefly to Ian to say a little bit more about the dating of this and the effect it's had, because and I should just introduce Ian as well. Ian Watts, who's here with us this evening, and has been with us all along actually, was the ochre specialist at Blombos Cave when the world's first art was discovered, and he's still the leading authority on the ochre record of human evolution today. So Ian, just say a few words, please, on all this.
Okay, thanks. I think your starting point has to be that red ochre, archaeologically, is the first sign we have for any kind of signaling in hominin evolution. But it's not just any kind of signaling, it's specifically ritual signaling. And it begins about 500,000 years ago in Africa, which is exactly when we begin to see that final exponential increase in brain size. Now, initially it's fairly sporadic, say between 500,000 and 300,000, but by about 300,000, we're beginning to find it in more and more sites. And by around 200,000 or shortly afterwards, at least in Southern Africa, we're finding it in every single campsite. So it is now a ubiquitous and regular behavior. Now, the early record, because it wasn't just our ancestors who were getting larger brained and costs falling on the mothers, it was also the ancestors of Neanderthals. They're also beginning to play around with ochre from at least 250, probably 400,000 years ago. But they never reach this explosion that we see in Africa, in Southern Africa, from around 170,000 years ago. And what we think is that this is the mark of the human revolution, that when it becomes ubiquitous and regular, we can be pretty confident that people are sharing symbolic constructs, shared fictions across vast landscapes. And it's this that enables them to leave Africa, and it's a hallmark of our dispersal around the world. You know, the first evidence of humans in Australia or the Levant or in the Americas, the red ochre is always there where it had never been before. And with the Neanderthals, I mean, it's not until the very last Neanderthals that we see a lot of pigment use, and that's coinciding with the movement of Homo sapiens into Europe. So for most of this period, all we have is the ochre record itself until about 100,000 years ago, maybe a bit more, 140 in North Africa, where we begin to see some other elements of symbolic culture being added to the repertoire. Beads and engravings like we see here in the slides, the first burials. But this is the dawn of everything, not the rock art of France at 30,000 years ago, or anything like that. That really is the tea time.
Perhaps say in that when Ian and his team, Chris Henselwood and others, began finding this evidence of the world's first art, the criticism of Ian's work was to say, well, it could have been any color. Why, and what Ian's pointing out was because I'm just saying the various other alternative theories to the menstrual theory that you've got, Ian.
Yeah, they threw up loads of flack, like alternatives, functional alternatives, but none of them could explain the breadth of the data. Like, for instance, the past color selection criteria was not just for red; it was for the reddest, most saturated materials. The blacks, the whites, the yellows, they don't make an appearance. They're not there until tens of thousands of years later. I mean, even in places like Central Africa or in the Kalahari, where you don't have lots of rock exposures, and therefore the chances of finding ochre are more limited, what do we find in the ethnographic record? The hunter-gatherers used plant pigments instead. Now, that's never going to turn up in the archaeological record, but we know from the ethnography that the Mbuti or any of the pygmy groups are doing exactly the same thing as the Bushmen, but they're doing it with plant pigments, whereas the Bushmen had more access to ochre.
Yeah, so there were these silly theories about maybe it's insecticide, maybe it's to protect you from the sun, maybe it's a high preservative, maybe it's a kind of glue.
No, basically this was all thrown up just because they didn't like what we were saying. No one seriously believed any of that crap. It's just that they hated what we're saying.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Ian. That's great. So that's fantastic. And so now this is another piece of work that Ian has done with others. The earliest evidence for fully, theatrical ritual performance. I don't know, perhaps just again, that was brilliant, Ian. So maybe 2 minutes. We need to stop quite soon on Wonderwork Cave.
Well, this is a wonderful site. I mean, it's like a double or triple railway tunnel that goes back 140 meters into the hill. And so the back of it is pitch black. You cannot go there without firelight. And although it's not well dated at the back, the lithic industry is strongly suggesting that it's dating somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 years ago. So this is one of the sites where we're seeing the earliest ever use of pigments. And what are those pigments? They're red ochre and a glittery variant of ochre, of hematite. And they are sort of as conclusive proof as you're going to get that this was ritualized display, firelit, ritualized display, the best part of 500,000 years ago. No functional hypothesis is going to work back there. And these are materials that were continue to be valued right up to the recent past. I mean, the plant pigments or the ochre could be considered as currencies, ritual currencies in many African cultures. People would travel, in Australia, sort of round trips of 500 kilometers to get the best quality ochres. And the same in the Northern Cape as well. All cultures, whether you sort of pastoralists, farmers, hunter-gatherers, they would all go to these meccas of specularite.
So think of gold mining or diamond mining, the world's first mining for absolutely, precious material. Gold really was actually mining for ochre. And actually in Graeber's book, Debt, which I think is a very, very, very fine book, David Graeber points out that things like gold and silver and camwood and other things. In every case, these forms of what, not quite money really, but something rather like kind of money, are always they're kind of useless except for adorning the body. They're like beads, silver necklaces, silver bracelets, gold necklaces, gold bracelets and stuff. It's the appearance of the body and the way in which they make the body sacred and valuable. So that's what there's no more precious substances than those. Talking about the hematite, it's glittery. It's like glitter. You put glitter on your body to make it sparkle in the firelight. And so now, and then just this is the final slide, I think. This is how we get from sort of brute facts, just the world as it really is, the ordinary physical world, the world that monkeys and apes live in, to the kind of virtual reality that we humans, all of us, inhabit. And we get into it simply by females signaling that they're not what they are biologically. We might look like human females that you can have sex with, but actually we're antelopes and we're males, and anyway we're bleeding. So wrong species, wrong sex, wrong time is the signature for what might almost be called divinity. So to go back to the beginning of this evening's talk, when I was talking about the earliest kings were divine kings and they were sun worshippers, who were sun kings. No, not actually. These women here, that on the bottom left there is a picture I took of Hadza women doing their initiation ritual, Maitako, and on the right there is what is it? What are the people there, Camilla? Gui. That's an actually genuine photograph, one of the few genuine photographs of Gui hunter-gatherers in the Kalahari, again dancing the Eland bull dance. And what they're dancing their defiance. It's almost as if their ornamentation is like wall paint. They're saying no to men, but in a laughing, cheerful, joyful way, because no is obviously yes from another standpoint. No to sex is yes for all kinds of joy and solidarity between the women. And they're saying no with their bodies. Wrong species, wrong sex, wrong time. And you can check it out. Just look at the cave paintings, look at all the rock art. You'll find that
they use the horns to poke the men and keep them away, because the girls in the huts there, she's inside the hut.
The hut on the left is the hut in which is the Eland bull, the menstruating maiden.
And the girl is the bull.
Yeah. So I mean that's the human revolution. It happened. It turned the world absolutely upside down. The evidence is overwhelmingly that it did happen. It was the revolution that worked. Most revolutions in recent periods have had extraordinary ideals. The English Revolution, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution. But the eventual outcome was, to say disappointing is an understatement. I mean, in most cases, the outcome of those revolutions was pretty much the reverse of the aims of the revolutionaries. The human revolution.
Can you just explain why it worked, Chris? Why was it different from the?
Well, that's a very good. Yes,
revolutions. Because
okay. Well, I mean,
quickly,
it worked because actually, the men benefited from losing. That's one way of putting it. So if a bunch of women are exploiting you as a man by getting everything that you can't off you in the form of bride service, that is helping your babies. And from a Darwinian point of view, a Darwinian fitness point of view, you do far better by losing than by winning. If you win by violence and the result of that is that your baby isn't very well looked after, there's all kinds of conflicts, and so, then there's kind of physical victory over the female, and that it's not going to be your fitness advantage. But actually, if females form coalitions and exploit males for the benefit of the children, from a Darwinian standpoint, that's actually an advantage. So it's if you like the one form of revolution where the defeated side at a much deeper level actually benefits. But probably Camilla wants me to say a few other things. I mean, one of the things is
it's women about the moon, isn't it?
Yeah, all right, sorry. I mean,
maybe.
Okay, all right, let me finish then. So linked to that is the whole question of synchrony, and it's a hugely complex and very much debated topic. But the fact that the human female menstrual cycle, on average, is 29.5 days long, it's usually regarded by the scientific community as a coincidence. I'm told by various people oh, Chris, don't worry about it. It's just a coincidence. 29.5 days. Yes, it's exactly the time it takes for the moon to pass through its phases as seen from the Earth, but it's a coincidence. Well, it could be a coincidence. Remember that chimpanzees have a 36-day cycle. Bonobos have a 40-day cycle. Other primates have maybe quite close. Gibbons about 28 days. Different monkeys have. It's a kind of scatter, less than or more than the length of a lunar cycle. But the one primate, the one great ape in this case, that has exactly the length of cycle you'd predict if synchrony between females using the moon as active is the human female, 29.5 days. So that would mean that if you went on strike, if you carried out that ritual, that wrong sex, wrong species, wrong time ritual, you would to make it perhaps put it very, very simply, if a bunch of women are on strike in one locality, but a few miles away they're not on strike because they're all out of sync with each other, then of course males are very mobile, they can move around. Oh, that lot are on strike, well, let's go and look for some other females somewhere else. The critical thing is this: if you're timing your menstruation ceremonies to the moon, say for example, if it's at new moon that it's most likely that you perform one of these rituals, and everyone across the landscape is simultaneously performing ritual because they've got the same moon and it's new moon, then instead of having a local strike, you've got something much, much more powerful. You've got a general strike, a strike right across the landscape, and that's going to win.
Yeah, I was also thinking lunar
to
key going around and around, not.
Yeah.
Not. I wasn't so much thinking of the synchrony, but the lunar key.
Yes. Well, okay. So
no, you can throw another angle on it, which is that it seems as if what I was saying is that last explosion in ochre use, say around 170,000 years ago, seems to coincide, and this is a bit speculative, but it seems to coincide with a development in hunting techniques. And what we have to look at here is the context in which we evolved in Africa, which was of an alternate, like outside, is basically an alternation of dry season and wet season. And the dry season is a period of stress where females would be under particular stress. And yet, what do we find when we turn to the ethnographic record? We find that the most productive form of hunting practiced by the Hadza and the Bushmen was lunar phase-locked night-stand hunting, restricted to the dry season, the nights leading up to full moon. So when this strategy evolved, and I'm suggesting it's in that period, that turned a period of scarcity into one of relative abundance, absolute abundance in the case of the Hadza. And that surely should be a mark of a revolution. I mean, like, Marx and Engels always argued you can't have communism without abundance. And that's why they thought it was possible, because capitalism creates absolute abundance. Well, our first revolution did precisely the same.
Well done, Ian. Yeah.
Okay, I was still thinking about lunar key. I was still thinking about communism in motion and going around the cycle. So the women win one phase and then the men kind of win the other phase. And you keep that movement so that nobody gets stuck. So the whole question that Wenger and Graeber want to know in their book is about getting stuck. But if you're using this lunar cosmology, going on strike at the dark moon, coming back to sex after the hunting has been so successful at the full moon, then you're not getting stuck. You'll keep on going, waxing, waning. You listen to Dominic Christina in the period poem, we wax and we wane. This is the balance in the sexual politics of earliest humanity.
So one way of drawing a lesson would be to say it's very good to take power, but know when to surrender it. But don't surrender a power unless you're absolutely confident that that you're going to be able to seize power again and surrender it and seize it again. In this case, using the moon as a clock. Interestingly, David Graeber and Wenger, they kind of have that model, but which they apply to the upper Paleolithic cultures of the Ice Age. And they draw on that very famous work, Seasonal Variations of the Eskimo, where the Inuit move between summer and winter, communism in the winter, including sexual communism, and then on a certain day in the spring, switching to patriarchy, sort of a male-dominated family with a man and one or two wives, and then switching back to sexual communism, but it's on a seasonal basis. And there's absolutely no question that originally in Africa, that would have been on a lunar basis. As you know, hunter-gatherers are fundamentally lunar in terms of their mythology, as Ian's been beautifully able to point out. What we didn't know until Ian's recent work was it wasn't just, it was much more than we thought. We hadn't then that knowledge at the critical point in the emergence of modern Homo sapiens. We actually hunted by the moon with this lunar hunting. Which I mean, perhaps Ian, just you actually with the Hadza going to one of these hunting blinds where you're able to get up really close to the animals when they come to drink, but you need to be able to see what you're doing, and so there's only a relatively short period in the build up to full moon that this strategy is going to work. Perhaps describe what it was like going to one of these hunting blinds.
Yeah, the thing about the dry season is that there are very few water holes left. So both people and animals tend to aggregate around those few places. And a lot of animals will do some of their drinking at night because it reduces competition. But they'll tend to choose, unless they're very large, they'll tend to choose moonlit nights because of the threat from lion predation during dark moon. And for much the same reason, humans also prefer moonlit nights. They don't want to be hunted by the lions either. And they can't, and we have poor night vision, so we couldn't see what we were trying to hit with the spear anyway. So it's got to be at full moon or the nights leading up to full moon. And that's what we did. Not very successfully, but that's what
it is successful generally.
No. In general, yes, it is.
It's successful. We've got records of that.
When you say we weren't very successful, you just mean you and your friend.
Yeah, just the time I tagged along.
I still want you to say a bit more about tagging along. How could you have tagged along? How do they let you? Why do they let you there? Surely it can't have helped too much having you there.
Probably not, but maybe they thought might get a beer out of it or something, or at the end of it, and I'd expressed an interest, and they were quite happy to have me along.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Well,
we've finished.
Yeah. Go on, Camilla. Take charge.
Well, yeah, there are quite a few people asking questions or making comments in the chat. But does anybody want to ask a question? Raise your hand, or just wave or ask in the chat. Anybody would like to know more? I think earlier in the chat, Dan, we got Tam and then Mara Koo. Do you want to go, Tam, and then Mara?
Yes, absolutely. Fantastic, wonderful stuff. Just one point on that. I remember at the beginning of one of your chapters, when you quote Marx saying that a crucial point in the revolution is when a section of the ruling class splits off and joins the revolution. And that seemed to tie in exactly, that's exactly what seemed to happen with a section of the men split off because they were going to benefit from joining the women revolution. And so that idea of a revolution of the weak potentially as well, in the same way that the women, it wasn't violent revolution, it was revolution of the weaker that was able to win. And that's a very wonderful thing too. That's all. I've posted a poem by a friend of mine, which is very powerful as well. Selena Godin, The Periods, But that poem is absolutely incredible that you posted, Dominique. Wow.
Just to say, on the origin of language. The Aboriginal Australians and the Dogon and so many other indigenous people who've got a theory about the origin of language. The theory is, and I've got so many different versions, the first word was spoken by women. It was no. And it was spoken in blood, women's blood.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's exactly what we heard in that poem. It was that, you know, we're all connecting up. We sync the fuck up, as she put it. It was so beautiful.
Everybody I know knows how to bleed with me.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody I love knows how to bleed.
And so the wombs are talking to each other. Yeah. And
I've also learned through life.
The tribal poems on real revolutionary resistance. It's not
totally. I've also learned through life that it's always best to let the women have the last word as well.
Yeah, no, I get.
What about Mara having a word? Did you want to?
Dr. Mara.
Yeah, well, yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for the very interesting speech. I'm not an anthropologist, but I'm very interested in your speeches. And I would like to ask one question. The idea of men reading these signs and being disguised by the red, and knowing that a menstruating woman is potentially fertile, that requires a lot of knowledge on procreation and on their part in procreation. How does that fit into what you explained?
You want to answer? I mean, I can answer. I mean, okay. I mean, it used to be said, and perhaps it still is by certain people, that there's such a thing as ignorance of paternity. I've heard it said, there's a whole book on it actually, about Australian Aborigines, that they don't know that sex leads to procreation. And in fact, it's completely wrong. What happens is that when women are strong and powerful in a coalition, they actually have an interest in kind of confusing things. It's quite dangerous to let men know about the connection between their sex and any pregnancy, because of course, the danger is that the man you're with won't have been the father of your previous kids. And if that matters, you may be abusive towards those kids, or you might be with a guy who disappears, he gets killed, he runs off with another woman, and you're having to find somebody else. Again, your existing kids, he won't be the dad. So it's actually very much in women's interests to conceal ovulation, but equally to conceal from men any detailed knowledge of which guy is the father of which baby. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but what I think I'm trying to answer it by saying that your starting point, which is that it's difficult to know these things, I would query even that. I would say that any sort of ignorance is constructed. And women, just as one of the things to say is perhaps when David Graeber talks about divine kings, one of the points he makes is absolutely right. The divine king, just think of any monarch, doesn't want the subjects knowing about exactly how they eat, how they defecate, how they go to the toilet, how they scratch their nose, all these details about bodily processes. You know, it's very important that those kinds of details aren't important and aren't noticed. You're the sovereign. Now, when women are performing their rituals, what they really don't want is the male of the species picking and choosing between different females on the basis of, oh, summing her up. Oh, looks like I can get her pregnant tomorrow. Might have to wait a week or two before I can get her pregnant. So women have every interest in not allowing any of those details to be found out. And concealed ovulation is just one bodily part of the strategy of constructing a kind of necessary, valuable, helpful, I'm putting it in quotes now, ignorance.
But can I ask, so you think female knew about the reproductive cycles and male were not aware on their part?
I'll let Camilla answer.
I think we've got to look at our evolution from great ape and ultimately monkey ancestors. Those primates have body knowledge of their reproductive cycles, and males they respond very significantly to reproductive cycles of females. Chris was being a bit simplistic to suggest that we aren't the only primate that has concealed ovulation. For instance, langur monkeys, temple monkeys in India, they conceal ovulation for very significant reasons to do with the infanticide risk that Chris was highlighting. They really don't want males to know exactly when they're fertile. But amongst those langurs, it's also possibility that a dominant male, when he's holding a harem of females, he uses menstrual cues as a way to check which one is going to be fertile. So those monkeys, if that's happening with monkeys, I don't think there's any problem about it happening with hominins at all. It becomes a pretty obvious, salient sign that a woman's not pregnant, and therefore it has this very powerful. It really is the pivot between biology and culture, and as Chris says, then that signal becomes constructed in all kinds of ways, and there's basically two things to do with it. Either you hide it or you amplify it. You do one of those two things, but most religious systems all over the world, they do one of those two things.
Camilla, can I come in there? I mean, yeah. What I got from the langur studies was not just that, but that populations vary as to whether or not the females show menstruation.
Yeah,
and that variation depends on how much food there is.
Well, no, it's depending on, well, it's about season. Yeah. It's that some of the...
I mean, where they're literally living in temples and they're fed by humans, they were they were different from other populations where they weren't being provisioned in that way.
Yeah, but that wasn't the determinant. The determinant was like risk. I mean, they were showing it or not showing it in accordance with kind of infanticide risk.
When you say it, you mean showing menstruation?
Showing menstruation. I don't know. I didn't want to get too complicated on that one.
I think we need to open this discussion up to everybody else.
We do need to open the discussion.
It's a bit above my head at the moment.
Yeah. There are quite a few questions. Is there anyone who wants to talk? But there's some questions about the origin of women's oppression, which is always the big question. Who else had? There's a question about combining the grandmother hypothesis and the cosmetic revolution theory from Jean Lu. We kind of talked about that last week. We were talking about the grandmother hypothesis as the initial basis with Hurdy's cooperative childcare for the first section of brain size, the first big leap of brain size. And this sex strike or female cosmetic coalition theory would be based on those earlier alliances, but then become a symbolically signaled practice. So it becomes a ritual practice. So clearly the sex strike comes with the emergence of our species in the last 200,000-300,000 years, is what we'd argue. So I don't know if that answers that question. Any other questions people want to speak? Sutinder wanted to check on the quote, Chris. Was that ochre? The history begins with religion.
Ochre, yes, right.
Yeah, that was ochre. Have you got a source? Where was the
A.M. Ochre? I think is it on Kings? I can't remember the name of the book. Where is it now? I mean, I think he only wrote 2 books, very big books on Kings. So you'll find it very quickly on Google.
Ochre.
Yeah, A.M. Hocart, H-O-C-A-R-T.
Yeah.
It was something like 1929 or something. I haven't got it to hand, I'm afraid. But yes, he says history begins with religion. religion begins with divine kings, and the earliest kings were sun kings. And as I say, you know, the paradox is that sun kings mustn't see the sun. And I'm much more convinced by Fraser's argument that actually these divine kings have taken over really something which was originally the supernatural potency of equally, you know, protected and hedged about figures, namely menstruating maidens during their first menstruation. Just interestingly, Graeber, in his book on kings, he says hunter-gatherers have kings, including the ones which we mistakenly call egalitarian hunter-gatherers. So and he said we can say they have kings because they have forest spirits, including, say, the mistress of the game animal. So, but what he does say, he says that although hunter-gatherers have sovereignty in the form of kings, they don't let their kings come down to earth and take over a human body, like a divine king does. A divine king is like a god who's got a human body walking about as a person, but really he's kind of divine. Of course, when you think about it, precisely that exactly applies, as Fraser was able to show, to a menstruating maiden. If she's some kind of goddess, and you know, you can say that she's certainly got supernatural potency. She's linked to the moon. She's got all this power to bring on rain and stuff. That king or queen does come down and take over a body, namely the body of a girl. I'm so surprised at the sort of blockage that we all have, so many of us under these patriarchal conditions, a blockage on thinking that women can have power and that menstruation can be potent. And it's just a damaging blockage. Somehow, as scientists, we've got to get over it. As scientists and revolutionary scientists, we've got to get over that blockage. There was a question about the origins of women's oppression. It's a huge issue, but just to say very briefly, when we first became human in the way that Ian's described, with his nightstand hunting, we were able to slow down the rhythm of the hunt. Once a month, around full moon, we could get enough meat to keep us going for the rest of the month. That's a slow rhythm. Hunting, relaxing, hunting, relaxing, hunting up to full moon, and then relaxing with sex and feasting, enjoyment and play until the next new moon. You then begin your ritual, you begin to prepare for the hunt. And if we were hunting, for example, mammoths, which we were in parts of the world, Siberia, North America, or diprotodons in Australia, these giant animals, we could slow the hunt down. And if we could slow the hunt down to once a month, that was a rhythm which women were already designed in their bodies to be in tune with. So having a menstrual cycle meant your cycle could not just sort of talk in the way that the wonderful poet described, but your menstrual cycle was a sort of engine, the clock governing the work rhythms, the rhythms of work and play, work and play. Now, when that rhythm speeds up, it's difficult. So if once in parts of the world where those game animals became extinct or were hunted to extinction, and you had to scrabble around for small animals, and increasingly men, instead of being provisioners, were beginning to actually exploit their wives for whatever food they could get, everything began to change. It was much more difficult for women to have the monthly ritual of resistance, which was the secret of their strength. And once women were dispersed across the landscape, unable to link up, unable to use the moon as their clock, then men started doing things which they were able to do in the ways of, I mean, again, there's another whole issue, but I mean, if anyone's interested, just maybe start by reading my book. But I mean, what actually happened is that men start to menstruate. Male menstruation, which means male initiation, cutting the nose, cutting the ear, bleeding in these ways. The secret of all those male initiations, and we know this, the men themselves, among themselves, are open about it. They say we are stealing this secret from women. When we bleed, it's our own menstruation. Of course, it isn't. But on the other hand, it was one of the ways in which men increasingly usurp power over women, using the symbols of women's own power to do so. And Stonehenge is a huge monument. Our RAG member Lionel Sims, who sadly died a few months ago, he was able to show that Stonehenge, for example, was a massive monument designed to manage the transition from the hunter-gatherer's moon to increasingly the pastoralist's sun, if you like, moving from the sun to the moon by kind of using those stones to conflate sun and moon. Lionel called it the solarization of the moon. So anyone interested, look up Lionel Sims on that journal of the Royal Anthropological Institute. Mark's got his hand up, Mark Etkin.
There was a time when the left socialists thought that history was on our side, that in a sense, to some extent, it didn't really matter what activists and others did because things were moving in the right direction. It wasn't just Marxists, even sort of reformist activists, leftists had that view. We now live in a rather different period where very few people think socialism is inevitable. And it's clear to me, I think, that David Graeber and David Wengrow, one of their main motivations in the book, The Dawn of Everything, is to show a time when humans were choosing between egalitarian or not egalitarian, but choosing the sorts of lives they wanted to live. And that's why I think they're so averse to any idea that in prehistory there was any sort of determinism due to material circumstances pushing evolution or pushing human development in any particular direction. This is why I think they particularly like this period of, say, 10 to 30,000 years ago, when there appeared to be this huge variety of different ways of living, and they imagine or they suggest that humans chose. So I mean, I think that's one of the reasons they're so stuck, and one of the reasons they have this aversion to any kind of looking at the ways in which we evolved from other apes. But the question I would like to ask Chris and possibly Camilla, and it came up, I think, in the chat from, I think, Dan, was, could you remind us, or tell those of us who don't know about it, what attempts were made over the years to debate Graeber and Wengrow around all these issues? Because I think if I recall correctly, in 2015, when Graeber and Wengrow first introduced the basic ideas of the Dawn of Everything in an article in the Journal of the Royal Anthropological Institute, I think called Farewell to the Childhood of Man. I think I could be wrong about the title. Anyway, there was an attempt to get some kind of debate going in that journal, I think, and then it all fell through. I don't know whether you want to say anything about that.
I'd say something brief and then let Camilla say. What happened was that the two authors, I'm confident about this because, you know, I happen to know some of the emails and so on building up to it. The two authors just told the editors, we don't want this debate. So the kind of very comradely engagement on our part, because of course everyone has to remember that David Graeber often came to RAG and gave talks, and in fact the talk that's led to that article was a RAG talk, and then they had another RAG talk talking about it all. They really did not want to debate with us, and they closed it down, and it was a shame. It's absolutely clear they didn't want to debate with us. Camilla, Camilla was very upset because Camilla put a huge amount of effort into trying to stress a kind of a more gender-aware model, and they just got very annoyed. And I thought were actually very rude to Camilla the way they treated her.
Well, they just didn't respond. Refused to answer any email or respond to me, which wasn't very. It wasn't really in the spirit of academic debate at all, which was sad. But the sad bit is that we really, because of our model of waxing and waning of this movement, this balance of power by the keeping power in motion, what Moynihan calls communism in motion. This fits with their idea that they highlight in the Upper Paleolithic about oscillation, about change, shift by season. That you can have a season when you kind of create hierarchy and then you pull it all down and go back to egalitarianism. And in some ways that corresponds to our idea of going round the waxing moon with women's power and taboo, and then surrender in the waning moon, and then go back to women's power and taboo. It could fit if they paid attention to Africa, if they believed in African hunter-gatherers really being egalitarian, and if they paid attention to gender, we would have the dawn of everything, and they're telling maybe the tea time of everything. It's like it could all fit together. So it's very frustrating that they had that attitude, really.
I think there's a point to draw out there, a point of convergence between as you were saying, between our model and Graeber and Wengro's, which is that, I mean, what we're saying is that from about 30,000 or 25,000 years ago, our very success as big game hunters undermined the material basis of women's solidarity in many parts of the world, particularly in the Americas, in Australia, but also over large parts of Eurasia. And so we're both agreeing that Engels had it wrong in a sense, in that he was tying everything to agriculture, you know, that the things were going wrong at a material level long before that. Yeah. But they're not interested in engaging in the material, you know, in the materialist underpinnings of society.
They resist that. Jean-Loup, did you want to intervene?
Possible.
Thank you. Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Sorry for my English. I'm French.
Okay.
Nobody's perfect.
We can forgive that, I think. Yeah. On this occasion.
Okay. So what I wanted to say is that I think that all the book of Graeber and Wengro is ideology for me. It's not anthropology, it's ideology. And the fact is that when I read French anthropologists or archaeologists, they speak about your work quite well, and they are mentioning it. For example, I've read Claudine Cohen. I don't know if you know her, and that's why I was asking about the combination between grandmother hypothesis and female cosmetic theory, because she's also praising and criticizing your work, and she's playing grandmother hypothesis against female cosmetic coalition, because she says that and I think it's wrong that she's wrong to do that, but she said that female cosmetic theory is a kind of meat for sex theory for her, and I think that it's wrong, and that grandmother hypothesis and female cosmetic strategy can be combined, because maybe it's when you become a grandmother that you know this relationship between menstruations and the possibility to give birth, and it's maybe the beginning of the discovery.
Yeah.
Okay, so I wanted to know if you're interested in the reception of your work in France, not only for anthropology, but also for historian of revolution, as I am, for example.
Jean-Loup, that's very interesting and very heartening. It's great. Let me say about meat for sex. Chimpanzees, when they hunt monkeys, that most definitely is meat for sex, in the sense that the male chimpanzee will have this, two females will fight to, for the baby monkey, pulling it apart, and a female who wants any share of that meat, she will have to go right up to where the males are and follow them around and offer sex while she's also trying to eat some of that meat. I mean, that's quite a good example of, if you like, meat for sex. With the sex strike theory, I mean, it can be misunderstood, of course, but sex strike is not even a theory, really. It's just a description of what actually happens with hunters and gatherers. It's called bride service. I'm sure you know this. It's just that men have to go and visit their sexual partner who's living with her mum, and everything he gets has to be surrendered to his in-laws. It's not that no one's calculating so much meat for so much sex. It's not, and anyone who sort of tries to work out some kind of parallel with going to a brothel and having, prostitution, I'll give you an hour for, so many francs, and, a couple of hours if you pay double time or something. It's quite the opposite. The sex not going to happen until everyone's happy, until everyone's free of economic securities. Once the meat's been brought home, around full moon, if it's this kind of hunting that Ian's talking about, all the economic worries are gone, and people can just enjoy sex just because sex can be fun when you're not anxious about where the next meal is coming from. So it's a shame that people try to load prostitution in the sense of competition between females in a sort of trading relationship with males offering so much sex for so much money. It's a shame that people do that. I suppose people who are, rather immersed in Western cultural assumptions about these things might be tempted to, but it's a pity. But anyway, Camilla is the figure who is, I'm sure you know, and your colleague, you were mentioning those, who probably more than anyone else has linked up the grandmother hypothesis with Sarah Hurdy's stuff and with the questions of brain size.
I was just going to say on the sex for meat that there are so many generally male evolutionary psychologists, anthropologists, who make the assumption that because men hunt meat and have the big game, they must be able to control the resources and therefore be able to control having access to women. For instance, somebody like Paul Seabright, even people like Rob Foley and Clive Gamble, the control of resources means basically male control of women. And that is just the opposite of what happens in a hunter-gatherer camp, certainly African hunter-gatherer camp. We were talking about it last week, of the sons-in-law having to do bride service to have any right to have sex. They've got to go hunting. They've got to be successful. Nobody's going to look on them with favor if they're not too successful. And they've got to surrender the meat. They don't have control over the meat. Somebody else takes it off them, and it goes to the in-laws. It goes to the mother-in-law particularly. So it's like grandmother, the mother of the bride, is the boss. And it's just so little understood how this thing works. And that's an effective sex strike. I mean, that's like a small nugget of a big ritual sex strike that the mother and daughter, the mother can say to the daughter, no, say, down tools, take you out of there. You're not working for if there's no meat.
And Kilby's got a hand up. And we've seen you on the screen all along. I'd like to hear from you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I'm by profession a counselor, but have no nearer than that connection with anthropology. What I was thinking about was once you have pregnancy, of course, then you have birth. And in many societies, the man was not allowed to be present at the birth of his child. And in some others, he was allowed. But I'm thinking about the grandmother influence you've been talking about here, that of course in that situation it would essentially be the grandmother and the aunties who would be assuring that the man's child would be born alive and healthy as far as was possible. But I wanted to have your comments about that whole matter, about present at the birth or not present at the birth, because we know here in modern times how extremely positive it has been for men to be able to be there at the delivery of their children.
One of the things we have to do is avoid treating this category called man as a sort of single thing. Men can be brothers, sons, husbands, and so on. We all know that. But in the societies we're talking about, there's a strong tendency, along with matrilocal residence, in other words, along with a woman living with a mum, for her to be in constant contact with her mother's other children, so in other words, her brothers and sisters. And a child in a society where the kinship is sort of biased in that direction, it will be the woman's brother who has an interest in the child. I mean, in other words, from a man's point of view, his children are his sister's children. It's only when you get a patriarchal system where men get control over their wives and lose interest in and support for their sister, that women then become more under the control of their husbands. And of course, in our own Western society, yes, of course. I mean, there's no other man around who's likely to want to be or be helpful during childbirth. But in traditional societies, actually, women have got quite a strong, in hunter-gatherer societies, especially gender egalitarian hunter societies, women have got a strong interest in identifying in solidarity with their own, with their sons and brothers, and kind of excluding husbands from knowing who exactly might be the father, but actually making, in some ways, it's kind of none of his business. As far as his children are concerned, and obviously it varies, but to the extent that the society is matrilocal and perhaps tipping towards a matrilineal descent system, a man wants to take care of children and be interested in all those things. It's his sister's children he should be interested in. And by the way, I would just say the brilliant thing about a child being looked after by its mum and brother is that kinship is for life. Have you ever heard of an ex-brother, an ex-sister? You can have an ex-husband, an ex-wife, but an ex-brother, ex-sister, that means there can't be divorce. A child brought up by parents who are his mother or her mother and the brother, that's for life. And that's a far more secure system than our horrendously unstable situation where, you've got this couple where it all depends on the sexual chemistry and you never know how long it's going to last. And the kid's sky falls in when the parents split up. It's a ridiculous system, actually. It's far better to have kinship rather than this overemphasis on marriage that characterizes patriarchy.
Matriarchal clans, better, yes. Yeah, are there other questions people want to go? We're getting 8:15 now, but if there's some more questions, yeah,
Barbara.
please, Barbara.
Hi, thank you very much. I've so enjoyed this. I'm not an anthropologist. My only claim is that my daughter's read anthropology at Edinburgh, and she's not an anthropologist now, but she's used it a lot in her career. It's just a general comment, which is blindingly obvious, really, but I have studied social science along the way, and it always seems really stupid to me about the Freudian claim of penis envy, because just absolutely crazy. And it seems to me that's a reincarnation of this whole thing. It must be the other way around, surely, because only a woman can give birth. And if we're going to have envy, and I don't think we should anyway, but if we're going to frame it like that, it seems counterintuitive to me.
There's a whole book written by Bruno Bettelheim called Symbolic Wounds, which is a kind of Freudian, like reverse Freudian argument, trying to explain why men seem to love bleeding. All our gods, all our high priests, the Rotarians, the Freemasons, they all go through these male rituals where they've got to bleed. So he's describing all these religions where you have male bloodshed as menstruation envy. So it certainly works equally well that way. And yes, by the way, there's not a society in the world where the men monopolize ritual power to the exclusion of women. There's not a single case anywhere where the males in monopolizing power over women, ritual power, it's not a single case where they don't bleed and where their secret isn't, we stole this from women. These are called matriarchy myths, but the secret of those myths lies in the rituals where men actually do literally steal from women menstruation and childbirth. They say, well, in many Papua New Guinea societies, oh yeah, women give birth to flesh, but spirit, no, they're going to be twice more. The men are going to do this. So the men go through menstruation and childbirth to make a real person, using the argument that all women do is produce the body and not the mind, or the flesh and not the spirit. And it kind of goes on today. It sort of goes on today still, really. I always think it's rather important to remember that certainly in this country, in Britain, all our major universities were once theological colleges, and we're not too far away from the kind of weird upside down thinking on these matters, and the very strange taboo on menstruation.
We have crucifixes on the wall with example male menstruation, so.
And bleeding hearts all over the place, and yeah.
Sacred Hearts and male menstruation all over Catholic and Christian theology. So I think we could carry that a long way.
I want to stress that I'm a great fan of the real Jesus. He was a revolutionary. He was.
Okay.
all this St. Paul's mystification and nonsense about his wounds and all that stuff. It's just the poor guy was, you know, he was obviously a revolutionary freedom fighter against Roman occupation of Palestine. So when we make the, I don't, you know, some people think I'm making fun of the guy. I'm certainly not. I'm a great admirer.
Not sure. Any last questions? Thanks for all the questions here. They're really good ones, but we may not have answered them all adequately. Anybody else would like a go?
Remind me what's next. Remind us what's next,
Well,
Sam.
we can say what's next week. Chris is going to do the first out of a series of 3 looking at the grammar of mythology in the light of the model that we've talked about, with the waxing and waning of the moon and these symbolic oppositions, structural oppositions that arise out of that. How can we address the model has certain predictions about mythology, which Chris can go into, discussing also the work of Levi-Strauss next week. Is that right? And next week you're going to be dealing with trickster, which feels like it's my subject, but maybe I can tell a trickster story in there somehow.
Is a genius at telling trickster stories, so probably it'll be
but you can do the lecture. I like it when you do the lecture, the hard work, and I just pop in for a bit.
Okay, that's great.
So come next week if you're interested in the story of the trickster in this world and the other world, and how we can discuss mythology in terms of the question, how did we get stuck? Which is, of course, Wenger and Graeber's question. And then the week after that, we're going to have a break from Human Origins because we've got an excellent contribution from Jeff Hughes on Islam activism and the marriage crisis in Jordan. So that will be a very interesting question on a different subject. But then Chris will come back and do a couple more on the mythology. So we've got a series of 3 on the mythology for anyone interested.
Okay, everyone. Cheers.
Lawrence has given the all the syllabus up on the website. If you want to look for it, just Google radicalanthropologygroup.org and you'll find it. And thank you very much for all the contributions, and I hope we'll see you again next week.
Yeah.
Very good.